Thank you everyone for joining us for our third session during EU Green Week. We will discuss how to prepare for biodiversity today. My name is Nicole Kosowski and I am the head of engagement here at Planet Tracker. Planet Tracker is a nonprofit sustainable finance think tank working on aligning financial markets with a sustainable future. We produce research on nature-related risks and opportunities and advocate for financial markets to integrate these into their analysis and ultimately their decision-making. Everything that we do as a think tank is for the common good, so you can find all of our research really available on our website and on the most common financial data platforms. Despite a lot of well-respected studies, investors and lenders seem to be reluctant to move biodiversity to the top of their agenda. So today we want to discuss with you why financial institutions should prepare for biodiversity. We will look at what is driving biodiversity loss, and we will then discuss why financial institutions should be focusing on biodiversity, examining both the financial and the environmental aspects. And after that, we will examine what financial institutions can do about it and what steps they should take. Biodiversity is essential for the process that supports all life on Earth. Without a wide range of animals, plants, microorganisms, we cannot have a healthy ecosystem that we rely on, which provides us with the air we breathe, the food we eat, and many products and services which we consume. It's quite helpful to see it from a natural capital perspective, as it clearly demonstrates that nature underpins the success and the resilience of almost every business. Natural capital is the stock of renewable and non-renewable resources that combine to yield a flow of benefits to people, which we refer to as ecosystem services. And biodiversity in that is a characteristic of healthy natural capital assets. It underpins nature's capacity to generate flows of ecosystem services, such as how birds and animals pollinate our crops, worms being essential to soil fertility, forests preventing the spread of diseases, or peatlands absorbing carbon. The resilience of nature is directly related to the health and the status of biodiversity. But our planet is under severe threat, and we have known this for a long time. One of the most well-known indicators of the state of the natural world is the WWF's Living Planet Index. The Living Planet Index is a measure of the state of the world's biological diversity based on population trends of vertebrate species from terrestrial, freshwater, and marine habitats, and is used as an indicator of progress by the Convention of Biological Diversity. So the latest 2022 report shows that wildlife populations, so mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, and fish, have dropped by 69% since 1970, which is a staggering decline. And human activity is playing a key part in eroding our ecological foundations. Human activities have already severely altered 75% of land and 66% of marine environments. Around 25% of plant and animal species are threatened by human actions, with 1 million species facing extinction, many within decades. You can see some examples on the graphic here. Over 85% of wetlands have been lost. 50% of coral reefs have been destroyed. Just to note that coral reefs host more than a quarter of all marine fish species. So this is quite a significant decline. And in a business as usual scenario, more than 99% of coral reefs will be lost. And lastly, looking at species, a 41% decline in non-insect species. And it seems that we aren't well prepared for the future either. The International Union for Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, publishes the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, which is the most comprehensive data source on the global extinction risk status of animals, of fungus, and plant species. And out of the just over 150,000 species they assess, 42,108 were categorized as threatened. They estimate that the number of threatened species increased fourfold in the last 20 years. And other academic studies suggest that the current extinction rates are 1,000 times higher than natural background rates, and that future rates are likely to be 10,000 times higher. And we often hear that in the past 50 years, they have been unprecedented in human history with the extraordinary increases in economic output. But as we can see, the growth has come at a heavy cost to the natural systems. I'm sure you have seen the 2023 Global Risk Report by the World Economic Forum. What it showed us is that we are unprepared to tackle biodiversity issues, and that might be quite contradictory to what you have seen in the press and what others have picked up. The report collects views from 12,000 business leaders from over 120 countries, and it is based on the survey, it ranked the severity of short and long-term global risks. Whilst biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse rank fourth in the long term, meaning that it will be a key risk in 10 years' time, it only ranked 18th in the short term. Only business leaders from 2 countries have placed biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse as a top 5 risk within the next 2 years. That's 2 countries out of 120. On the right, you can see the risks which business leaders identify to be the most pressing. What we find puzzling is that a number of these short-term risks identified include climate change threats, such as the failure to mitigate climate change, which is ranked as number 4, and a failure of climate change adaptation, which is ranked as number 7. To us, this implies that there is a lack of understanding of the interdependence of climate and nature. And we could go on, ranked as number 9 in the short term are natural resource crises, which again would imply a concern over nature and biodiversity issues. At Planet Tracker, we have examined these top short-term risks, which the World Economic Forum has identified, and found that half of them could be affected by biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. So we want to highlight that the climate and nature are interconnected. Climate is at the top of the investor agenda, but investors seem to have less capacity for biodiversity. However, if we look at the definition of nature, which is all the plants, animals, and things that exist in the universe that are not made by people, it is clear that climate is a part of nature. And nature and climate are inextricably linked and need to be looked at in conjunction with one another, because if we don't, it is likely we run the risk of issues exacerbating one another. I will give you a specific example on this interconnectivity between the two. On the chart on the right, we are looking at biodiversity loss and climate change interactions and what financial stability implications they have, in this case for central banks and financial supervisors. This example is looking at 2 sectors. It's looking at infrastructure and agriculture, and the chart shows the impact from climate change and biodiversity loss on both sectors. Both sectors are exposed to and are contributing to climate change and biodiversity loss. Higher greenhouse gas emissions and land use change contribute to climate change, resulting in lower rainfall or more extreme weather events. In turn, land use change, habitat fragmentation, and pollution result in increased biodiversity loss. This in turn leads, for instance, to the loss of soil fertility and less resilience to natural hazards. These changes have an impact on both the infrastructure and the agricultural sector. For the infrastructure sector, the increase in extreme weather events and less resilience to natural hazard translates into higher damages and the need to relocate activities. The lower rainfall and loss of soil fertility in turn translates into lower crop yields and disrupts production for the agriculture sector. And we can translate this into a set of risks from credit to market to liquidity risks and to macroeconomic impacts. I'm not going to go through all of them, but if you just look at the agriculture sector, the lower crop yields and the disrupted production increases the probability of loss or defaults. It makes food prices and derivatives more volatile, and the likelihood for weather-related insurance claims goes up. And lastly, this can lead to inflation and value chain disruptions. And also quite critical to stress is that these impacts may have compounding economic impacts that result in higher than expected financial risks. This is due to compound risks significantly magnifying the impacts of individual shocks in terms of both the severity and the duration. So I hope that this example makes it clear that we need to consider both when we assess not just the climate risk, but the nature risk as a whole. So now let's have a look at the wider economy and how different sectors are exposed to biodiversity. A commonly circulated statistic that we see is that roughly half of global GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature. Recently, PwC have published a report which has increased that dependency slightly, but we do want to call out this myth that it's just a proportion of global economic value that is dependent on nature, because ultimately the entire global economy is dependent on it, which is something that can be seen in the chart on the right. It identifies what industries are dependent on nature, and it estimates what percentage of gross value add from an industry and its supply chain has a high, medium, or low dependence on nature. And what we see is that all these sectors have a dependency on nature and therefore also on biodiversity, both directly or through their supply chain. And this dependency approach is a very interesting one because it is a step closer to understanding the risks of biodiversity loss to operational cash flows, asset values, and the wider economy. And speaking of the wider economy, it is important to highlight that it's not just corporates who are exposed to risks presented by biodiversity loss, but countries too. In one of our recent reports called Nature-Dependent Exporters, we examined the countries which are most heavily dependent on nature in terms of what the countries produce and what they export. And as part of the analysis, we have compared the credit ratings between OECD and non-OECD countries. And whilst credit ratings are remaining quite robust for OECD countries, regardless of their dependency on nature-dependent exports, the opposite is the case for non-OECD countries we have examined. We have observed a strong negative relationship between credit ratings and nature-dependent exports there, leaving non-OECD countries depending on nature exports much more exposed. And this leads us to the risks that financial institutions are exposed to. In the Eurozone alone, 40% of banks have not properly assessed their exposure to nature-related risks yet. There's been an article in the FT this morning with the ECB where the ECB has found that 72% of Eurozone companies and 3/4 of bank loans in the region are exposed to the loss of biodiversity. So this shows the importance of conducting a risk assessment. The Institute for Sustainability Leadership at the University of Cambridge has put together a handbook outlining the key concepts and framework for identifying nature-related financial risks. Financial institutions need to examine the nature-related financial risks they are exposed to, such as the physical risks, the transition risks, and the liability risks. Then dive deeper into how these risks manifest, looking at 10 categories of ecosystem services decline and responses to nature loss. Then assessing the economic impacts, which can be seen in column C, and finally translating them into financial risks. Nature loss becomes a financial risk when physical, transition, and liability risk manifest and start causing impact upon companies and governments to which financial institutions are exposed to via their loans, via debt or equity holdings and revenues from financial services. It's causing negative impacts upon financial markets, including commodity and money markets, to which financial institutions have exposure to through investments or financial services, and also causing negative impacts upon the operations of property of financial institutions. So, for instance, a lack of green space in cities can lead to fast water runoff, causing flash flooding that damages their property. So this is really a clear case for making this assessment. And another consideration for financial institutions investing in companies that impact biodiversity are frameworks like the UN Global Biodiversity Framework. The framework was signed last year in December in Montreal, and it will require financial institutions to monitor, assess, disclose risks on the dependencies and impacts on biodiversity in order to reduce these negative impacts, but also increase the positive ones. So looking at what issues financial institutions need to address, it's also quite helpful to look at the key drivers of biodiversity loss. 90% of all biodiversity loss can be attributed to just 5 key areas. It's land and sea use change, it's climate change, it's natural resources use and exploitation, it's pollution, and it's invasive alien species. It's helpful to map out these areas and zone in on key issues within them. An example for this is the global food system. The global food system is one of the primary drivers of biodiversity loss, with agriculture alone being responsible for more than 85% of the 28,000 species at risk of extinction. At the same time, the food system is responsible for roughly 1/3 of global emissions. when done right, tackling key issues in the food system can get you almost two for the price of one, where both climate and biodiversity issues are getting addressed. We at Planet Tracker have recently published a roadmap for the financial system for how to transform the global food system. In it, we set out 4 food transformation themes that financial institutions should focus on to ensure that they are aligning their capital and investment process with the food system changes required. Financial institutions should be looking at responsible supply chains, work on increasing food system efficiency, looking at the reduction of pollution and the increase of sustainable product offerings. And out of those, we identified 6 priority actions, which you can see on the screen here. These actions should be aimed to be achieved by 2030 and are fully traceable supply chains, halving food loss and waste, stopping deforestation, cutting methane emissions by 45%, making agriculture and aquaculture systems more regenerative, and investing in alternative proteins. Actioning these 6 priority actions would cut global emissions by 20% and the food system's overall footprint by 60%, so saving 10 gigatons of CO2 equivalent to double the current US emissions, and producing an estimated economic benefit of over 1.5 trillion US dollars. So a very clear case of taking action. And looking at all of these issues, it might be a bit overwhelming, but there are a lot of resources available to financial institutions to understand the issues related to nature and biodiversity, as well as understanding their exposure to harmful sectors. We listed a few different helpful sources on the screen here, but this by no means is extensive. The first one that I want to highlight is the formation of the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. They are developing a risk management and disclosure framework for organizations to help them report and act on nature-related risks and opportunities. It's a very helpful guideline. They have published a 4th version of the beta framework, and it is currently out for market consultation. The TNFD also provides a number of helpful resources in their knowledge bank, so we would highly recommend exploring what the TNFD has to offer. Another important resource is the Science Based Targets Initiative. It's an initiative providing clearly defined pathways for companies and financial institutions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The targets are science-based, and if they are in line with what the latest climate science deems necessary to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. The targets are sector-specific and include sectors with a very heavy impact on biodiversity, such as the apparel industry, chemicals, and food and land use sector. We would equally encourage financial institutions to work with business groups and networks in collaborative engagements. I think hopefully it is clear from this presentation that this is a systemic issue, and a key part will be to get governments to adopt policies to reverse nature loss. And Business for Nature is doing exactly that. There are also other groups, such as the newly formed NA100, the Nature Action 100, which will be formally launched this summer, which will establish a common agenda for company engagements for companies which have a large impact on nature. If that is something that you're interested in, please feel free to reach out to us directly. Lastly, there's a number of other tools and research and frameworks available out there as well. And in this context, I would like to highlight Planet Tracker's research as well. As mentioned earlier, everything that we produce is available to the common good. We produce research on nature-related risks and opportunities with a particular focus on food and land use, oceans, and materials such as textiles, plastics, and petrochemicals. And we provide a number of tools on our website, from data dashboards to engagement sheets for stewardship teams to deep dive reports on key nature-related issues, as well as some company assessments on their transition pathways and company case studies on sustainability and profitability. And this leads me to the research that we have used for this presentation. Our biocrastination report examined the 2023 Global Risk Report by the World Economic Forum and well-known biodiversity indicators in more detail. So if you're interested in it, I highly recommend you have a look at it. Our nature-dependent exporters analysis classifies exports dependent on nature. It dives it divides countries into high, medium, and low nature-dependent exporters and examines countries with high dependency by looking at common characteristics based on measures such as credit ratings, GDP per capita, economic inequality, food security, soil erosion, and climate resilience. And lastly, our financial markets roadmap for transforming the global food system report. I spoke about it already, but apart from identifying the key priorities, we have done quite an extensive analysis on what the global food system actually looks like and mapped out the food system into 8 different nodes and analyzed over 400,000 companies. So these are some of the resources that are available and what financial institutions can use. So this brings us to the end of our presentation. And I hope what this short presentation has shown you is that there is a lack of urgency when it comes to biodiversity, but that we do need to act. Financial institutions do have exposure to biodiversity issues, and there is a very clear need to act on these risks and do that in the near-term future. But there is hope. There are quite a lot of tools available. And if there are any questions on any of the tools or anything that we have used, please feel free to reach out to us directly. We'd be happy to help. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. If you have any questions, please send them in the chat or send them to us directly. We're happy to reach back out and have any further discussions with you. Thank you.